Hi, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in to Psytech Summit. We're about to start a beautiful panel of legacy leaders of this revolution that's been going on. And I want to pass this over to Keren Tzarfaty, who we all met earlier, to lead this beautiful panel. Thanks, Keren.
Thank you. So I'm thrilled and honored to introduce Rick Doblin, the founder and executive producer of MAPS, and Michael Mithoefer, the Senior Medical Director for Medical Affairs, trainer and supervisor at MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, and Annie Mithoefer, registered nurse, supervisor, trainer for MAPS Benefit Corporation. Hello, it's really nice to see you. Just to say, as we begin, hi, just to say that they are my friends and colleagues and mentors, and I'm thrilled to lead this panel together.
Yeah, we wish we could be joining you in Israel, but this is a lot easier.
Yes.
Not as much fun, but definitely easier.
Right, right. So welcome. And I will have many questions to ask you, and I hope we'll have enough time for all of them. And I want to start by asking you about what brought you to this work, to MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, and what called you from the very beginning? Why are you here?
Well, maybe I can start. What caused me to get really involved with MDMA research was taking MDMA. So I tried it in 1982, and I was initially very skeptical about it because I was used to the classic psychedelics and large doses of LSD or mescaline or other psychedelics, mushrooms, and I was used to this whole ego dissolution and this idea that for a period of time you're not really verbal, you're in a different approach to consciousness. And so I just thought, how powerful can a drug be? How useful could it be even? Where you can sit around in a circle and talk to a bunch of people, where you're more or less still yourself and present, in some ways in your normal frame of consciousness, but just you have a reduction of fear, an ability to speak at a more defenseless, honest, open way. But I diminished it. I like to say that I was stupid enough to underestimate it, but smart enough to buy some. And so when I tried it, I had just been for a month at Esalen with Stan Grof in a workshop, Stan and Christina Grof. And while there was a young woman that was part of our group, more or less my age, and I sat for her for an LSD trip. And there was nothing sexual going on with us, but we cared about each other a lot. And she gave me this sort of necklace as a present for sitting for her. And then when I came home with the MDMA and did it with my girlfriend, that could have been kind of a delicate discussion. Who's this other woman? What are you doing? Why'd she give you this present? And I just felt like we could talk about it in such a beautiful, open-hearted, loving manner that it was like a triumph over, jealousy and insecurities. And I just felt it was utterly profound. And then I felt that the love that we were expressing for each other, it felt like not a drug effect. It felt like it was releasing something that was in us already that we could now communicate better and clearer. And so that's what really led me to, I'd already been committed to psychedelics for other reasons, just because I felt that we need this unitive mystical experience. We need to feel our core connections with everybody as an antidote to genocide, antidote to racism and all of that. So I was already deeply committed to psychedelics, in large part from actually reading Stan Grof's Realms of the Human Unconscious observations from LSD research. But taking MDMA, it was like a whole different kind of a substance, and the experience was so useful and so profound that I felt that this was a new thing to research. And also when I learned about it, it was still being used in a quiet way, legally, under the codename Adam as a therapeutic drug, but it had already escaped into being used recreationally under the name ecstasy. And this was now, again, 1982. It was Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan, escalation of the drug war. And I knew that MDMA was, the legal status of it was doomed. Eventually it was going to be criminalized. And I felt like I woke up to LSD and the power of psychedelics in 1972, 71 and 72 after the backlash. And I felt now I'm finding out about MDMA before the backlash, which was an incredible opportunity. So to introduce it to people who wouldn't otherwise do an illegal drug, but might do something that was legal and then speak out when the time came on its behalf. And so that's all the factors that really got it. And then I'll just add that in 1984, I had an opportunity to sit for someone who was suicidal from terrible PTSD. And I saw how it was helpful tremendously for PTSD. So that's what committed me. And then in MAPS, we started in 86 after we sued the DEA to try to keep the therapeutic use of MDMA legal. The judge agreed with us and said it should be Schedule III, meaning available as a prescription medicine, but illegal for recreational use. The administrator of the DEA rejected that recommendation, and we won a couple times in the appeals courts. Eventually we lost. And so it seemed like the only way through was through the FDA, through science, through medicine. And that's where I started MAPS in 86 with the primary goal of trying to work with MDMA to make it into a medicine. And now here we are 34 years later.
That's beautiful.
We're still trying, but we're getting close. And actually this Friday, we're going to learn if the first of our 2 phase 3 studies was statistically significant. So that's going to be a massive turning point. We're hopeful, but we just don't know until we get the data.
Great, thank you, Rick. That's beautiful. Annie, Michael?
Up to you, Annie.
Yeah, thanks, Rick, and thanks, Keren. You know, I think what brought me and us to it was helping the patients that we were seeing in our private practice and that we were doing breathwork groups with. We were doing breathwork groups for 10 years with some people in the community and also some private patients, and just constantly looking for new ways of helping people. Breathwork was really a good way to help people, but it took maybe longer than MDMA. We weren't sure. So we were, on that path. And we had had our own experience with MDMA, with someone sitting for us individually and as a couple before it was made illegal. So we knew the power of it, and we were just, hoping that maybe we could do some research. I'll let Michael add.
Yeah, it really came out of the research for us both came out of clinical need, not, I actually had no interest in setting out to be a researcher 20 years ago when I set out to be a researcher. But, after, like Rick, being in college in the 60s, I'd had experiences with psychedelics and I thought they were very valuable. And then I kind of moved on. And as Annie said, then later we had experiences with MDMA and saw how powerful it was for communication and for helping just, look fearlessly at yourself. So it was, I actually switched from emergency medicine to psychiatry almost 40 years ago now, because of reading Stan Grof's work. So Stan Grof is a huge influence on both of us also, as he was for Rick. So from the start of practicing psychiatry, we were oriented toward working with ways of shifting consciousness using non-drug ways like holotropic breath work for 10 years until we decided, it was really behooved us to look at these other options for the people that weren't being helped by other methods. So, that's when I had my first conversation with Rick. I've only been working on this for 20 years. And I was actually interested in studying all of the above. But when Rick and I had our first conversation, we quickly came to the agreement that there was something particularly about MDMA that could be particularly valuable for PTSD. So that's what that, and having no idea what I was getting into were the things that brought me here.
That's partially because I didn't know what I was getting into either.
Well,
No.
you said at the time you had a 5-year, $5 million plan for legalization, so that we're a little
Luck-
behind schedule, but we're making it.
Luckily, we all have a lot of stamina.
Right. And I imagine that, you know, when you look back at the journey, which has been more than 20 years now, do you have any special moments that you remember that were specifically meaningful for you? Or another way to look at it is to think about milestones that personally and professionally are standing out for you?
It would be easier to name the moments that weren't so special because there's so many special ones.
That's funny. Well, I was going to name a moment that was special because of something, Michael, that you and Annie kind of decided to do together. And this was when we got permission for the very first Mdma PTSD study. And this was at the time where Michael was affiliated with the Medical University of South Carolina. And once we got the approval, it turned out that they didn't want to be involved with the study, the medical university, and so they told Michael that he would either need to quit the study or they would kick him out of his affiliation with the medical university. And so Michael said goodbye to the university. So that was a tremendous moment. I'll just say another moment was similar to this, was that you know, we had gotten FDA approval, and then we had gotten IRB approval from the Western IRB, which is the largest institutional review board for non-local studies, meaning for people that are not affiliated with institutions. Once we got kicked out of Medical University of South Carolina, we tried to do the study out of Michael and Annie's office. And that's okay, we had FDA approval. And so we got approval from the Western IRB, and I thought, this is great. Now we just go to the IRB, and they're gonna say yes. I mean, the DEA. The DEA will automatically, it just takes a while. It's a question of when, not if you have FDA and IRB approval. But then a month after we got the approval, the Western IRB sent us a message saying that they had revoked the approval and that they felt that we had lied to them and misled them about the risks of MDMA, and that they had had a board member that didn't like the fact they approved it. She contacted a couple of people, Una McCann, the NIDA-funded neurotoxicity researcher, and others. And so they felt that they were misled and they revoked their approval, which was heartbreaking for us to get. But then we went through this long negotiation of many, many months with them of getting experts, over 12 experts in different areas, to write letters to the IRB. And eventually the IRB said, it's not about the science. We're not going to approve this. And here's your money back, which is really rare for them to do that. And that was really disappointing. And then when you're rejected from one IRB, when you go to the next one, you have to tell them what happened with the one before. So you're sort of carrying this legacy of this IRB that said no, but at least they didn't say on the basis of science. It was on the basis of they didn't like this looking at MDMA. So we had to go through 7 different IRBs. All of them either refused to let us file, or they took it for a while, then they said they weren't going to approve it. So then I realized we could start our own IRB as an institution. So we, I did all the paperwork. I figured out MAPS could start its own IRB. And then I thought, well, that's you know, if we could be authorized by somebody outside, that would be better. So I went one more time and I looked through the list of IRBs that were private IRBs. There were about 28 of them. And there was one that was in North Carolina. Michael and Annie were in Charleston, South Carolina, and its name was Copernicus. And I felt that if there's any IRB that's sensitive to science and religion, blocking research, this would be the one that's willing to listen to us. And in the end, they did, and they ended up approving the study. So that was one of the tremendous moments for me.
Well, related to that, Rick, it's reminding me of the moment when you called us when we were on vacation to tell us that George Riccardi's paper claiming dopamine toxicity had been retracted because it wasn't MDMA at all. And that was the thing that was really influencing the IRB. So that moment when you said the paper's been retracted, I'll never forget that call. That was a long time ago now, but it's very vivid in my memory.
Yeah, that was
I
great.
think for me, the memory Rick had about the medical university was a very hard memory for me. But a really good memory was just our first participant. And, you know, she'd had lots of struggles and years of PTSD. And she said she would go to Tibet. She would do anything. She would go to Tibet. She didn't think she would ever take a psychedelic, and about an hour into her session, this is our very first person, we're not sure if we're going to get placebo or MDMA. She takes her eye shades off and says, I guess I'm not going to have to go to Tibet. And she had a little smile on her face. And I mean, that just was such an incredible moment that, oh my gosh, here's this person. And, you know, just like I felt like the medicine was there giving us hope too, you know, that we could trust the medicine, trust the study.
Yeah, that was an amazing moment. We looked at each other because it was reassuring us as much as it was her.
Yeah.
And also, to this day, I think this is one of the most fascinating aspects of MDMA that we don't really understand yet. How did she know? She said, I've tried everything. I've done a lot of therapy. I've taken all these medicines. Nothing has helped. That's the only reason I'm even willing to consider anything like this. And within 1 hour, she knew that she could heal. And she still had to heal. That was not the end of the story by any means. She went on to have challenging, difficult processing of trauma. That was all to come. But somehow in that moment, and you could say, well, she was affected by drugs, so she had this rose-colored glasses or something. But in fact, she was perceiving the truth in that moment. It wasn't rose-colored glasses. She had coal-colored or, dirty glasses or something before, because she was convinced that she couldn't get better. She felt hopeless. So she apprehended the actual truth of the matter immediately. And so it wasn't just a drug distortion. It was the medicine helping her access the truth, an actual accurate perspective. And then she had to go on and actualize that through a lot of hard work and struggle. But I think that's something very remarkable about this medicine.
Wow, that's fantastic. You also brought to mind another story with this same participant. So Copernicus IRB that approved the study, they were still nervous about it. And so they said that we had to buy a $1 million insurance policy to indemnify the IRB in case any of the patients sued the IRB for approving the study. So we ended up spending about $50,000 on insurance, but they were very worried about patients suing them. So when you're running a study as the sponsor, I don't get to know who the patients are. That's all privacy, that's all protected. So after this first participant had completed her treatment, she sent me an email, and she said she'd found out who I was, and she was the first participant, and she wanted to talk. And I was like terrified. Oh my God, this is the first participant. Now she's going to be suing, MAPS and suing, I didn't know what, because I hadn't heard these stories at the time about how well it went or anything like that. So when I opened up the email, she was like, I just want to thank you. This has been so great. I feel much better. That was like a transition moment for me.
And
just one more, Karen. Can I add just a bookend to what Rick told about the Medical University of South Carolina back in 2000? When was it?
Yeah, around
2003 or 2 or 1, 2001. Last year, I got an email from the Medical University saying, this may come as a surprise coming from us, but we would like to start a state-of-the-art psychedelic research, treatment, and training center. Would you be willing to help us? So that shows a little indicator of how things have changed.
Right. It's nice.
And the Western IRB, just to add to this, the Western IRB ended up buying Copernicus IRB. I got invited to give a talk to the Western IRB's annual conference, where they have people from all over the country from their different IRB panels. And they told me that I could share the story of how they had initially approved and then rejected the protocol, and how I could add an appeal for people to, in these IRB panels, to focus on the science and try to let the politics go by. So even the Western IRB has now reformed as well.
You know, you talk and it's very clear how the bureaucracy and all the bad reputation of psychedelics is present or was present, but also how the spirit of the medicine itself, the empathy, the love, the connection it brings is very alive, you know, when you describe the work with the client, and how it's actually meeting the spirit of the person. Like it's together, it's working together. I also wanted to ask you about the challenges. Like if you look back, or even in the present, you know, in this present time, what do you find to be most challenging, and how do you deal with it? I'm thinking if somebody new is coming to a psychedelic drug development field, what would be your advice around the challenges and how to be prepared for that?
We have lots of inpatients and lots of patients at the same time.
Yeah. I think for us, I'd say the challenges are twofold right now. You know, over the history of MAPS, in 34 years, we've raised over $100 million in donations, which is absolutely astonishing. But we need to raise another 30 million more to take MDMA to Europe and around the world. And I think that the challenges have been a lot fundraising. Fundraising has been a rate limiting factor. You know, we couldn't go too fast because in phase 2, you need to learn a lot of different things. We could have maybe had more parallel studies at the same time if we had more money, but we didn't. So I think fundraising now is a challenge now that there's also a lot of for-profit companies which have good access to capital. And so we have to demonstrate to the donors why nonprofit drug development is different and better, and why they should give away their money rather than invest it, and how investing would change things in terms of the incentives, and how we want to share the information openly and want to encourage competition, and we want to also work on drug policy reform so people can sort of heal themselves where possible or with peer support. So I think fundraising is a big challenge. The other thing is the challenge of success, of things, you know, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now we're like 100 people. It used to be, you know, very few people, and we were all communicating with each other, and it was very easy and simple, and we could act very quickly. And now we have bureaucracy and layers of management, and things get more conservative in some ways, and we get more removed from the actual healings that people are doing. So that's a little bit challenging. But also I think the FDA has become more challenging recently, and that's because I think they realize that we might and are actually probably likely to succeed, and that the psilocybin people are coming along as well. And so we see a certain kind of conservatism at the FDA, where they're wanting to protect their institution, they're wanting to protect their reputations, and they're imposing, or they're trying to impose, things that look rigorous and look good but don't make sense. So for example, they want the lead of our 2-person teams, which we have. FDA has sort of switched now to saying that they want the lead person to be an MD or a PhD rather than just a licensed therapist. So we're arguing that out with the FDA. I think we're going to prevail because we have the data. FDA is just coming from a position of trying to be protective. So I think that's something I advise people to be careful of, is that the regulatory agencies, once it's early on and they think you've got very little chance of succeeding, they may actually be more open and realistic. And then once it comes to this point, and it'll accelerate a lot if our first phase 3 study was statistically significant, because that means our second phase 3 study is likely to be significant, and we're, you know, on a pretty good track to make it into a medicine. So I think dealing with the final stages and where the FDA is now looking at bureaucratic protectionism rather than basing decisions on the science and the data, that's another challenge.
Yeah. Anything else to add, Michael? Any?
Well, I think what Rick said about growing and, you know, it also is going to be a huge thing when we do get it approval to grow in the training department, train more therapists, supervise more teams, and just the, going from being, well, we have 6 trainers, including you and Ido in Israel, but really moving on to having more trainers and more teams to do, more people to do supervision is another big, I feel like a big challenge.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you. And looking to the future, what do you think about how psychedelic are likely to be regulated as prescription medication?
Right. Well, that's an easy question, actually, because we've already been negotiating with FDA in kind of early preliminary ways about this. So the FDA has a program called REMS, which stands for Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. And that's where they can apply kind of custom regulations to the particular drug and the particular patient population that is being approved in. And so I think the key thing to say is that MDMA is not the treatment. It's the therapy that's the treatment, and the MDMA helps the therapy be more effective. So therefore, once it's approved as a medicine, it's only going to be delivered by people that have been through the sponsor's training program or training programs that we authorize, like Keren, what you and Ido, may be doing in Israel. And so in addition, because it's the therapy, not the drug, it's only going to be administered under direct supervision of therapists. It's never going to be a take-home medicine. So all of those things make it easy from the drug diversion perspective, in contrast to medical marijuana, where people get a prescription for a month or whatever, they do it at home, and who knows, if they give it all away or take some of it and give some of it away or sell it, but it's easy. Psychedelics are going to be easy to regulate because they will only be administered by trained people under direct supervision. And I think that's the key aspect of how it'll be regulated going forward.
So that takes me to the next question around this issue. How do you see the interaction between drug development research and the drug policy reform?
That's a good one for you too, Rick.
Okay. Yes, I was waiting to give you a chance, but I will take that one too. I think that they're mutually reinforcing. I think that most of the researchers don't see that. They're worried that, and I think that this is becoming less so, but in the past there was a worry that as we were in the early stages of this research, if the research was used to argue for drug policy reform, that might cause the DEA or the FDA to try to stop the research if they didn't like these drug policy reform maneuvers or efforts. But I don't think that has happened at all, that we haven't seen that. And actually what we see is that the FDA really wants to see the research move forward. And what happens in drug policy reform is independent. In America, in just a few days, a week from today, in addition to the election for the president, there's going to be a lot of state elections, of course. And in Oregon, there's the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative, which is an effort to create a state program where they will authorize certain kind of therapist guides. They don't always have to be therapists, to provide psilocybin to people in the state without any kind of violation of state law. It will still violate federal law, and that they are going to be able to treat not just people that have a medical condition, but people that want personal growth, healthy people, for various kind of all sorts of issues that they might want to address with psilocybin. And so the FDA has expressed to George Goldsmith, who is the founder of Compass, that they were worried about the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative. But the reason that they were worried is that they thought that if it passes, it might reduce interest in sponsors going through the FDA. If you can just do this on a state-by-state basis, and they sort of alluded to medical marijuana. which has been approved in Israel, also in the US and many countries without the research. But it doesn't get covered by insurance that way. And what we see is that the sponsors like MAPS, like Compass, like USONA are as or more interested in going through the FDA than ever before. We're not going to stop because drug policy reform is taking place. And in fact, we do really think from an equity point of view, we need to go through the FDA. A lot of people wouldn't do these things unless it's approved by the FDA, but also that's the way to get insurance coverage. So I think it's a fundamental violation of people's human rights that these drugs are illegal. People should have the right to explore their consciousness, particularly psychedelics that have been used for thousands of years for personal growth and religious and spiritual inspiration. And we need a dual track. One is the medicalization, which changes people's minds, which then reinforces the legalization. And then the drug policy reform makes it so that the progress that we make in research isn't threatening the status quo so much, because the reason that psychedelics have been blocked in the 70s and the 80s and much of the 90s all over the world was the fear that good news about psychedelics would challenge the propaganda of the drug war. So the more that you work to diminish the propaganda of the drug war or the enthusiasm for mass incarceration and the use of the criminal justice system rather than healthcare, the more that you see those changes, then the easier it is for regulatory agencies to move forward with medicalization, because as I say, it doesn't sort of challenge the dominant narrative. So I think that we really need this dual track. And I think our nonprofit drug development approach permits us to be about the only organization in the field that is trying to do drug development that also endorses drug policy reform, because that will take a whole bunch of potential patients or clients, you could say, out of buying it as a medicine and buying it in some other way from other people, other providers. But because we're a nonprofit, we're in favor of that.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going back to the actual work with the clients and with the participants, and the focus of the research. The focus of the research now is really with PTSD, and we're looking at specific diagnoses. And I'm also curious about other implications and lessons for psychiatry and for psychology that go beyond the specific diagnosis. If you have any thoughts about extension of the learning from the research.
It's my favorite topic, along with
I know.
why the first person, how'd you guess, Karen? Along with the first participant knowing seeing that she could get better. It's related to that, because I think what really fascinates me, along with a lot of the rest of it, is, it's really important that we're doing rigorous controlled trials focused on a diagnosis. That's really important. And as we get data about primarily PTSD, also MAPS has done studies with social anxiety and end-of-life anxiety, that kind of thing. So a few things, but we're mostly focused on these few diagnoses, especially PTSD. But as we get that very promising data, we also get these other signals about what's happening, including decreases in depression scores and improved sleep, other things like that. And at the same time, we're getting signals about this process that goes far beyond just reducing the PTSD symptoms, is what people are describing and what we're measuring in some ways. So I think that's something not to be ignored, because there's a danger of being reductionist in trying to explain MDMA completely according to ideas we already have about what helps with PTSD, like prolonged exposure and cognitive processing and all these things that we've recognized with other therapies. Those are important aspects of it, but so much more is going on that it has the potential to teach us a much broader view of what psychological healing is. So not only looking at other indications, but looking at the bigger picture of how deep and interesting and rich this process is when we use these medicines in a way that doesn't try to direct the process too much. And so, it's interesting because in psychiatry, it's very, very common. It's the usual thing to have, basically, there are only a few classes of medicines, and most of them are used for a very wide range of diagnoses. So, but in the case of existing psychopharmacology, I think that is a reflection of a weakness of the treatments. They aren't really getting at the basic cause. And these symptoms cross these diagnostic lines. So the fact that you use one class of medicines for so many different things in psychiatry, again, is a sign of the limitations of those drugs, I think. But in the case of MDMA, I think it's a sign of the strength of this kind of drug. The fact that it's catalyzing this process that goes beyond what we understand now, but is clearly effective, at least in our phase 2 data, for helping these diagnoses, but a lot more is happening. And that, I think, that's the really exciting part, that we're gonna learn more and more about that. And it's also interesting looking at how the neuroscience can support some of this, because there's neuroscience that supports some of our ideas about prolonged exposure and processing trauma with decreased activity in amygdala, increased activity in prefrontal cortex. Some of that science supports what we see in terms of that kind of thinking about what treats PTSD. But there's also this interesting stuff about, Robin Carhart Harris's idea of relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. So what he's learning with his imaging studies fits really well with the idea that there's something much more going on. It's somehow opening up people to a whole new possibilities of ways to respond in many more ways than just processing trauma. So I think that's what's, I think these medicines have the potential to really change and perhaps breathe new life into psychiatry and reuniting psychiatry and psychotherapy. And so I think that part is really exciting.
Michael, you're really talking about expanding the view of what's happening in a very deep way beyond pathology. So it's almost like seeing the person and the inner experience and the self as bigger than the wounds, and having much more mysterious information that is still to be discovered. But what therapist can come with this approach? So I'm taking us to think about what kind of trainings and experience, and sometimes even personality, the psychedelic therapist is needing in order to hold such an approach, and to embody it.
Well, I can make sort of an easy comment, and then Michael can elaborate. But the easy comment is just about whether the therapists need their own experience with these drugs. And I don't think that they do, but I think that if they have these experiences, it will make them a lot more effective. So I don't think it's essential, but I think it's extremely helpful. You wouldn't go to a massage therapist that's never had a massage. You wouldn't go to a yoga teacher that's never done yoga. You wouldn't go to meditation teacher that never meditated. And so why should you go to a psychedelic therapist that's never done a psychedelic? Or, in the age of psychoanalysis, the psychoanalysts need to go through their own psychoanalysis process as the patient. So we have a protocol from FDA for 120 people. We've treated about 90 therapists where they can get MDMA in a scientific study, and they've said how tremendously helpful it is. I think the psilocybin training programs don't include a protocol to give psilocybin to their therapists. But I just was contacted in Canada. They've got some approval for compassionate use of psilocybin for people that have cancer. And they're wondering about how do they train enough therapists to do this. And they're thinking about whether they can just skip giving them the psilocybin. And they just contacted Stan Grof. His message this morning was about how in Spring Grove and in the Czech Republic, where he did his early work with LSD, Spring Grove was in Maryland, they came to the United States, that they had protocols, not just for the therapists, but for the nurses in the ward, for even if they weren't during therapy, they all were encouraged to try LSD. So I think this, the expense and the regulatory challenges of trying to figure out a way to do this are stuff that we have to address, but that I think the training should offer, ideally, therapists the opportunity to be their own patient in a therapeutic setting and absorb exactly how the therapy is done in that way. And that's one of the best training tools that we have.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Yeah. Well, I think going through your own work, Rick just mentioned that. And for me, going through the holotropic breathwork training was really my training in holding space, being there when people were in deep processes, and just, not doing, being there, holding the space, and not being triggered by a big process that people are having. We found that people who have gone through our training that are therapists have said even going through our training and not getting MDMA has changed the way they see themselves with their clients when they go back to work. So watching us sit with people and hold the space for them to have this healing process, and how we have loving kindness, non-judgmental approaches, guided by the inner healer. So we're not guiding the therapy. Just watching our videos and going to our training changes people when they go back to work. So do you want to add stuff, Michael?
Yeah, I think you alluded, Karen, there are kind of two parts. One is what are the kind of traits of the therapist, and what is the training that are necessary. And Rick and I have talked about the importance of the capacity to be present in a way that I think requires having done your own inner work deeply. And the question about training, I think, is really interesting. And I think it depends a lot on what the situation is. But I do think, well, I hardly ever quote Freud, and I'm not a very good Freud scholar, but he said something to the effect that housewives would probably be better analysts than physicians. And I think he was onto something there. So I think that, there are the medical sides of these drugs, these medicines. And so somebody has to have enough medical knowledge to assess risk, but that doesn't have to be one of the therapists. And, I think there is, when you're treating people with severe PTSD, it can really be an advantage to have a very good foundation of training and experience working with these kinds of people. However, I think it's absurd to think that PhDs or MDs are better at it than master's level therapists. And I think there are many people that aren't master's level therapists that could be very effective facilitators given the right orientation and the right circumstance with the right kind of supporting people that for whom that's the adequate level of support.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. So a few more minutes. And my last question is about where you see yourself and the work after the approval of the FDA. So Friday is a big day, and we're going to get some important numbers. And let's imagine that maybe we can also hear about timelines, Rick, that in a few years we'll have the approval. And what's then for MAPS, for you?
Yeah, well, I would say, just to go on the timeline. So we have to do 2 phase 3 studies. We've already started the second one. Because of COVID, it's not going as fast as we would do otherwise. And so we think somewhere around the early to middle of 2022. So a year and a half from now, something like that, we should be ready to apply to the FDA for approval. And we will also apply to the Israeli Ministry of Health and also Health Canada, because we've got phase 3 sites in Israel, Canada, and the United States. And we think by early 2023, potentially late 2022, we should have approval for prescription use. And depending on this fundraising for Europe and the rest of the world, we think that assuming we can do that and don't have to slow the studies down for financial reasons in Europe, that we should have approval from the European Medicines Agency near the end of 2023. We only have to do one phase 3 study in Europe, and then instead of 2, and they'll accept the US data. And then most countries of the world, except notably China and Japan, will take our data from FDA and European Medicines Agency and approve the drug without any additional studies. We just, in their countries, we just have to train the therapists. So that's the timeline. I think the things that we need to do, and we're just in the early stages of, we need to really explore group therapy. So we need to look at new modalities that maybe will be, I don't know if we could get it where they're more effective and less expensive. I think they'll be less effective, but also substantially less expensive. But maybe we can find ways to leverage the group process. So that's going to be a big issue. But I think we're now starting to plan the next psychedelic science conference. We've had some in 2010, 2013, 2017. So next week, we think we're signing a contract in Denver for Psychedelic Science 2023. We think people can be ready to travel by then. It's $1 million gamble on our part because we have to reserve hotels in the Denver Convention Center. But we think that will be the doorway to the new world, you know, the doorway to prescription use. And then I imagine for myself, I'd love to, my wife actually wants to move to Asheville, where Michael and Annie are. So maybe we could set up a little clinic, meet some people. And I, of course, want to also have a spot down by the beach in Florida. And so I could imagine myself, you know, walking barefoot to my office by the beach through the sand somehow or other, and you know, having a little psychedelic clinic. Because in 1972, when I was 18, I decided I wanted to go through psychedelic therapy and become a legal psychedelic therapist. And so it's been roughly a 50-year detour. But I hope I have to do a clinic. Two of them would be great. One in Asheville and one in.
That's nice. And Michael and Annie, do you want to conclude?
Well, after walking through the door into the future, I like all that Rick is talking about. I hope he and Lynn do come to Asheville. And I also have my 74th birthday this week, and we have 4 grandchildren. So after walking through the door of the future, I'm going to shift the ratio of grandchildren time to MAPS time, so the ratio will be higher, but it won't be infinite either.
Hear, hear. That's all I'm going to say. I like all the ideas they've brought up.
Oh, it's wonderful. Okay, so I want to really thank you for the work you do and for sharing it with us today. And always a pleasure. And we'll see you soon again.
Thank you for the work you
Keren.
do, Karen.
Thank
Always
you
a
so
pleasure.
much.